I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. I also want to give a special welcome to all of those who are tuning in to our live webcast as well. The UW Showcase Lecture Series is a partnership proudly sponsored between the Wisconsin Alumni Association and Capitol Lakes Retirement Community. So big thanks to Capitol Lakes for having us here tonight. Tonight we have Deb Bloom as our speaker, and for our residents tonight, I want to assure you it is not the Deb Bloom that you may know here. Our Deb Bloom is a professor of journalism and mass communications at UW-Madison. She received her BA in 1982 from UW-Madison, came back to campus in 1997, and has been teaching ever since. In addition to being a professor who has a class where they stay late every time and upset the next class coming in, she's also a Pulitzer Prize-winning author of her book, The Poisoner's Handbook. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome me in joining Deborah Bloom.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kate, and it's really a privilege to be here and to talk about poison. And I usually feel like I have to say something to the effect of why would, a nice middle-aged mom like me have spent 5 years obsessing about how to kill people, which is an interesting question and has greatly changed the balance of life in my house. My husband no longer will let me pour him a cup of coffee. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how I got interested in this, and then I want to kind of tell you a story about why thinking about poison is such an interesting way to think about our own lives. This was a book that I've been a science writer a long time. I got my grad degree here in 1982. I worked for a newspaper in California where I won a Pulitzer. I wrote across a variety of subjects, and I kept coming back to this idea of telling a book about poisons and the kind of fascinating chemistry that they involve. And this is in a couple of ways. One is I grew up reading early 20th century mysteries. So if you knew Agatha Christie or Dorothy Sayers or even the British writer Georgette Heyer wrote some really interesting mysteries. I grew up very fascinated by the way those kind of storytellers would spin a poison murder and the kind of cool, interesting calculation that goes into a poison murder. And it was in the back of my mind as a science writer to write a book that was essentially an early 20th century murder mystery that told the story of the invention of how we learn to catch killers. So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about two other things. One is, and this is something that a science writer like myself would do, but not a scientist, which is, to me, I kind of give chemicals personalities, right? I think of them as, here's a dumb compound, here's a smart compound. Poisons are really smart compounds if you think about them in this way. We are ourselves a collection of chemicals. I'm standing here as I speak, inhaling chemicals. I've got a bottle of H2O here, right? Hydrogen and oxygen underneath the desk. So we live in a chemical world. And most of those chemicals do not do us harm and, in fact, help build us and support us. So the ones that do, the chemicals that actually poison us, are really clever. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more later, but they are very adept at taking advantage of who we are and the way our bodies work. And that cleverness of poisons was really interesting to me. And I added to it what I think of as the kind of not cleverness or calculation of the poisoner himself or herself. There's a myth that poison's a woman's weapon, but if you look at the FBI statistics, a little over 60% of all homicidal poisoners are men. So just to correct that at the start. But if you think about the poisoner, you know this. Poison is the only kind of murder that's always premeditated. You can lose your temper and with an impulse pick up a gun or a knife or a baseball bat, or a really big cookbook and commit a murder. But you cannot do that with a poison. You have to think. You don't say, I'm really mad at you, and so I'm going to go and research the best possible poison, and about 3 weeks from now you'll be finding it in your oatmeal. Poisons don't. That is a much more calculated system. And just to give you one very recent example of that, which is not from my book, which is early 20th century, a couple years ago there was a case in Missouri. It was a poisoning attempt by the wife of a highway patrol officer. And we'll stipulate at the beginning of this story that this was not a happy marriage. So she wanted to end the marriage. She did not want to go through all the problems of a divorce. And what she did is she went out and researched what was a really good plant that she could put in their garden to get rid of her husband. And she eventually settled on a very beautiful ornamental plant. It has pretty purple flowers, and it's called the Foxglove. And if you know the Foxglove plant, you know that it contains a compound that we use to manage heart rate. It's called digitalis. And if you get too much digitalis, it'll kill you. So she filled their garden with the Foxglove plant, and then she said to her husband, and this all came out at her trial, honey, I feel that you're gaining a little weight, and I'm going to start making you big green leafy salads for dinner. And she, in fact, did make these salads, put foxglove leaves in them, and her big mistake was she got the dose wrong. So he got very sick, called 911, went to the hospital. They pumped his stomach, found these peculiar leaves, ran the analysis, and realized that he was eating foxglove salad. And then one other thing happened. They went and searched the hard drive on her computer and found the search for the foxglove and the digitalis. So although my editor told me that I should never tell anyone how to kill someone, and I don't, the one thing I'm going to advise you is that if you do decide to do this, use the public library computer. So it will not be on your hard drive. But before we do that, I want to take you back to a point in time that we couldn't have done this, couldn't have found the foxglove, didn't know how to find a poison in the corpse. So this is back to early 20th century New York City, which is the setting for my book, The Poisoner's Handbook. And this is actually a 1918 shot of Manhattan. You'll see there the elevated trains that they used to have in New York that they no longer have. And 1918 is a really important year because this is the year that New York City issues a report saying that the clever poisoner can operate with impunity in Manhattan. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, this is a crime scene that I'm about to show you, but it's not particularly gruesome. This is also a 1918 crime scene. This is from Brooklyn. This was a gangster killing. So you only see the feet of the corpse here, the cop there. This is what you think of as a statement killing, which poisoners almost never do, right? I'm sending a message. I'm leaving the body out. It's a warning. The only time that we know that occasionally happens is in poison assassinations. And for instance, there was a dissident Russian spy who was poisoned by polonium-210 in London a few years ago. And you could call that a statement killing. The Russians didn't particularly try to keep it a secret. He left a trail of radiation all across the city, right? It's a message, don't mess with us, which this would be. But there's another problem here, and that is you see the cops standing here, but you don't see anyone in a CSI sense. As we would in our CSI era, you see no scientists there. Because at this time, there are no scientists who are working with the police department, right? There's no medical examiners. There's no forensic scientists. We did not, in this country, even establish a department in forensic medicine until 1933. So in 1918, there was nothing like this. What you had instead was an appointed coroner system. And in New York City at this time, this is an incredibly corrupt system. The city is run by a very powerful political machine. It was called Tammany Hall. And you got a position with Tammany Hall if you did the machine a favor. You can go back and you can look at the list of coroners in New York City from this time period. they're sign painters, they're milkmen, they're funeral home operators. They are occasionally people with medical training, but only doctors who have lost their practices for killing too many patients, but did a favor for the machine. And the chief coroner in New York City at this time period was a doctor, his name was Patrick Reardon, who was so famously an alcoholic that you can go back and you can look at the newspapers of the time, and they tell stories of Dr. Reardon coming to the crime scene with his 2 assistants who hold him upright, right? And there's one other problem with this system. These guys know absolutely nothing about cause of death. So the National Research Council actually did a survey of death certificates from the early 20th century. And literally, I read through a collection of them. They say things like, could be an auto accident or possibly diabetes. And you go, what? Or they would just, they wouldn't even go to look at the body, and so they just put act of God, which it could have been, right? But that doesn't actually help you solve a crime. So you find the police saying, we want absolutely nothing to do with science, because science is always screwing up our crime investigations. And it's at that point that my story really starts. Now, chemistry laboratories today don't look like this, right? But this is the chemistry laboratory of the New York City Medical Examiner's Office. This was about a 1930 photograph. And you see over here in suits a dark-haired gentleman standing up. That's Alexander Gettler. He was the first forensic chemist ever attached to an American city. And sitting down is Charles Norris, who was the first medical examiner of New York City and was forced upon the city of New York by the state. So Norris hires Alexander Gettler, and the 2 of them together literally start rewriting the rule books of crime detection. And that was not easy. Poisons were available to pretty much anyone who walked into a grocery store or pharmacy. Of course, that's true today. But different poisons. These are a few bottles from the Times. You'll see strychnine, you see atropine, and I can never read this middle one except that it says poison at the top. Strychnine was a very popular tonic. It would give your nerves a little jolt. It really would. So you were feeling a little tired, you just swigged down a little strychnine. Mercury was a popular tonic. You could buy that over the counter. And my favorite one, as an example, was arsenic. This is arsenic trioxide, which is probably the most famous homicidal poison in history. It was in every home. It was in every kitchen even, because it was used to color candy. Arsenic makes a beautiful green dye, and they used it to color candy in this time period. They used it to color cake decorations. They used it to dye artificial flowers. They used it to dye fabric. They used it to dye wallpaper. You've probably heard that Napoleon Bonaparte died of arsenic poisoning. They found, a lethal deposit in his hair. He was actually killed by his wallpaper, which is not nearly as exciting as an evil British plot. But he was in his prison in Elba. The room was plastered with what they called Paris green wallpaper. And as the salty sea air came in, mold started growing in the wallpaper, and it off-gassed arsenic gas and killed him. So, and just to give you an example of how casual people were about this, I'd like to show you this advertisement for Dr. McKenzie's improved harmless arsenic wafers. And if you can read down into that, it says, will produce the most lovely complexion the imagination could desire. Clear, fresh, free from blotch, blemish, coarseness, redness, freckles, or pimples. Arsenic does these wonderful cosmetic things for you. And arsenic was one of the most popular cosmetic formulas that women used in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The other formula that was widely known was called Fowler's solution. And if you go back and you think of that beautiful, ethereal, pale Victorian complexion, a lot of that was caused by Fowler's solution. You had a lot of women who took that to give them that pale complexion. They suffered a low-grade level of arsenic poisoning, and they were pale. And if they were unhappy with their husband, they had arsenic right there in the medicine cabinet. And there was one other thing about arsenic, which is kind of the granddaddy of homicidal poisons, or grandmother, and it was not detectable. So that I can pour my Fowler solution into your coffee. Arsenic's used to be a fabulous homicidal poison because it's tasteless, it's odorless, and it's colorless. And so I can pour it right in there and you're never going to know. And until the moment that scientists can figure out how to find a poison in the corpse, a poison like arsenic, which is a broad spectrum poison, just kind of made you sick. You had stomach pains. You had shortness in breathing. You had, your skin would discolor. You'd start getting sick. But there was no evidence that you were poisoned by arsenic, and if you were, they couldn't find it. And so in the early 19th century, you see chemists finally starting to say, we have got to put a stop to this. We have got to figure out how to detect poisons in a body, and this was the first and most famous of the tests. This is for arsenic. I love this slide because it's so 19th century and it's so primitive, but this was a cartoon of scientists doing the first test for arsenic. It's called the Marsh test. It was invented by a British chemist, James Marsh, and it was really basic, but remember that I was telling you that poisoners tend to be very calculating killers? You can actually go look back at poison methods in the 19th century and see that people start shifting from poisons like arsenic to plant poisons. Because now arsenic's detectable in the body, but plant poisons are not, and you can watch this sort of shift forward into plant poisons. And there's actually was a great case in France in which the prosecutor stood up in front of the courtroom, waving his arms and said, well, why don't we just tell all killers to use plant poisons then? There's never any evidence. And that changed about 20, 30 years later, about 1870 or so, when a chemist in Belgium figured out how to pull a plant alkaloid out of a corpse. And the first plant poison that came out of a corpse was nicotine. Most people don't realize how poisonous pure nicotine is, but it's a fantastically poisonous alkaloid. It's about 10 times as poisonous as cyanide in its pure form. And so if you look at, just to do a lethal dose thing, about 200 milligrams of cyanide will kill you, about 20 to 30 milligrams of nicotine. And if you're curious, in the average cigarette, and I went and looked this up in the FDA statistics, the average cigarette contains about 1.5 milligrams of nicotine. I started asking myself, if you were smoking about 30 cigarettes at the same time, how much of a dose of nicotine in its poisonous form would it give you? But nicotine's famous for that. So our heroes then have this very primitive toxicology. They have the industrial age in which chemists are now inventing all kinds of new poisons, and they're flooding the market. And they are making it up as they go. And Alexander Gettler here, we can thank for doing some of the fundamental toxicology that drives our CSI age today. From cyanide to arsenic, from carbon monoxide to alcohol, he was the first person in the world to be able to tell if someone was drunk at time of death. And he announced those results in 1930, which means he did all of his research during Prohibition when alcohol was technically illegal. And it took him 6,000 brains. So this was in the days of what we call wet chemistry. And it was 3 years later that a toxicologist in Indiana came up with the first breathalyzer, which he called the drunkometer. So I always love that name. But they are trying to figure this out as they go. They're sort of building the chemistry as they go. And to give you a sense of that, I'm going to ask you to help me solve a 1920s murder. So let me set the scene for this murder a little bit. You are the forensic detectives in this crime. And this is a murder that takes place in a tenement house on the Lower East Side of New York City. And if you know anything about these tenement houses, you know they were crowded with families with very, very little money. And they were poor, shabby places, most of them. This is an abandoned room in the Tenement House Museum in Manhattan today. But basically, except for the missing fireplace, it's not that far off what these rooms used to be like. These rooms often lacked heat. They were what they called cold water flats. They lacked electricity. There's a myth, right, that by the 1920s we all had electrical wiring in our houses. But that was only if you had the money to afford it. So in the 1920s, if you were poor and if you lived in a tenement house, you had gas lighting. And the gas involved was called illuminating gas because of the gas lighting, but it was also used to power many other things, stoves, refrigerators. And it was made from coal, and it contained two really dangerous gases. One is hydrogen, which is explosive, and the other is carbon monoxide, which is poisonous. And if you go back and you look at the statistics in New York City at the time, you'll see that there were in that city, an average of about 600 accidental illuminating gas deaths every year. Stoves leaked, refrigerators leaked, gas lines leaked, people died. But in this particular case, you, the forensic chemist, are called to a tenement apartment to look at a body. This, again, like the one I showed you in the pipe, is an actual crime scene photo from the 1920s. And this is in a tenement building on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. But our story is a little bit different. So you are the forensic chemist. You're going to walk down this hall to the apartment, but there won't be the body outside the apartment. You're just going to go through that door. And when you get into that room, you're in a very classic 1920s tenement house. The floors are splintered, the walls are peeling, it's gas lit, and there's clearly been a gas leak in this apartment because you can smell a little bit of the chemical they put into the gas. The police have the windows open. You go back into the back bedroom. There's a broken fitting on the wall in this bedroom, and there's a dead woman in the bed. She's in her early 20s. She's lying in the bed, flat on her back. She's clearly been dead for some time because she's stiff and she's cold and she's pale. And you look at that body, turn to the police and say, no, this is absolutely not an illuminating gas death. Because. Chemists, anyone know? So she's stiff and she's cold and she's pale. Yes, exactly. We have a forensic scientist right here. Carbon monoxide, the way it kills you, will flush your skin a cherry pink. It's a really profound chemical reaction. Carbon monoxide bonds to the protein in your blood that carries oxygen. This is called, it's called hemoglobin. And the bond between carbon monoxide and hemoglobin is 200 times stronger than the bond between oxygen and hemoglobin. So if you're in a situation where carbon monoxide is seeping into the air, it actually doesn't matter if you're breathing in oxygen because the carbon monoxide here you see me anthropomorphizing, is like a little chemical thug, and it literally just muscles the oxygen off that connection. And your blood fills up then. Your blood would normally be delivering oxygen to every cell in the body. It's called oxyhemoglobin, but now instead it's just delivering carbon monoxide. So you die of a kind of chemical suffocation, but in that chemical process, your blood cells turn a brilliant cherry pink. And here's a sort of cartoon of what happens when that happens. And this is such a profound reaction that if people do an autopsy, your organs are a brilliant cherry pink. And often when people see the corpse of someone killed by carbon monoxide, they'll talk about how healthy it looks, if you can imagine a healthy-looking corpse. So when you see this young woman, and she's cold and pale, you know that that's a problem, that this just can't be carbon monoxide. So that's exactly what Alexander Gettler says. They take the body back to the morgue, they do a blood test, and sure enough, there is not that high level of carbon monoxide saturation in the blood, but there is another gas that's built up to unusually high levels, and that gas is carbon dioxide. And that tells you that's exactly right. That tells you that this is a suffocation death. And that makes a lot of sense if you think about the way we breathe. We inhale oxygen, we exhale carbon dioxide. But what if you can't exhale, right? So if you can't exhale, carbon dioxide bubbles up in your blood, and it is the best chemical signal for a suffocation death. And so they go back and they look in the morgue and they study the body, and what they find, I hope this is showing up well, I hope you can see this well. Back in 1923, they did not do all those fancy photographs they do today on Bones and CSI shows. They hand drew their sketches. And this is actually the original autopsy sketch for Leah Freundlich, who's the woman who was murdered. And what you can really tell if you look at this, do you see that kind of cluster of arrows down the back of her neck there? What that is her husband's fingerprints bruised into the back of her neck. And what happened was that he had put a pillow over her face, held it so tight that he had left these black fingerprints. And after she was dead, he'd broken the gas fitting. And when they looked a little farther, they discovered, and this was a poor family, that he had taken out a life insurance policy before he did it. So he went to jail. What I wanted to, and it was the chemistry that convicted him, which was a very new idea for the police, very new. There's one other point that I want to make about this slide, which is that you may wonder where I got it. I got it from the killer's grandson. And after the Poisoner's Handbook came out, I heard from quite a few people whose stories were in this book, and I'm going to tell you another one. He wrote me, his grandfather had done his time, gotten out of prison, gone on and been a very sweet grandfather, apparently. And he had loved him, and he wanted him to be innocent. And he had done a lot of research, including hunting down this photograph. And he wrote me, and he sent me this, and he said, I just don't believe my grandfather is innocent, guilty. And I said, well, let me send you the chemistry report. And after I sent him the chemistry report, our conversation was over, right? Because I don't think he liked the finding. But I went and gave a talk about this to the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner of New York City last spring. And I told this story, and I said, it's so incredible to me that this is a murder from, 90 years ago. And this guy is still trying to fix the problem. And they said, that's exactly right, that we have people coming to see us for decades. They don't like the results. The crime hasn't been solved. They're still looking for justice. Murder casts a really long shadow. And that was an important lesson for me as a writer, because you think, well, I'm writing about this 1923 case and, it has no emotional repercussions, but in fact it does. So I want to show you this photograph as well. This is actually from an arsenic murder in the book. And this little, very serious-looking girl in the flowered hat is the opening of a chapter I wrote. If you look at Poisoner's Handbook, it does two things. It follows Alexander Gettler and Charles Norris as they try to build this forensic science, but every chapter is the story of a different poison. So there's an arsenic chapter, there's a carbon monoxide, two carbon monoxide chapters. There's a couple of alcohol poison alcohol, right, cyanide, thallium. And in the arsenic chapter, I started with a case that I want to mention because it says something else, which is there's a little restaurant on Lower Broadway, and somebody goes into their kitchen at night and mixes arsenic into the dough that they have in the refrigerator waiting for lunch the next day. And when they serve the lunch, all suspecting, and remember, arsenic's tasteless and odorless, they poison dozens and dozens of people. They actually, in the newspaper reports, they said the ambulances were screaming like in a concerto. People thought the city was burning up or something. There were so many ambulances. And a number of these people died. And one of them was this girl. She was only 16 at the time, though. And she was working at a little restaurant and went in and ordered a sandwich and some pie, and the pie killed her, or the crust of the pie killed her. And I got this photo from her great-nephew, who said to me, I picked up your book, and it was the first time I knew what had happened to my great-aunt, because she was a major family secret. She had gone to work to help support the family. And the reason I put it in the book, I'm a mom, was that in the newspaper stories of this event, when the police went and talked to her mother had tried to make her a lunch. She'd said, let me make you a lunch. And this girl, her name was Lillian. Lillian said, no, it's too hot. I'm just going to get something. And so you had this moment where she's talking to the cops like anyone would do, and thinking, if I just made her take the lunch, right? If I just talked her into the lunch. And I could just put myself right in her place at that moment, right? That moment where if you just made it different. And he wrote me, her nephew, he lives out in Seattle, and he said, no one would ever talk about her. He knew more about what happened to her from my book than from anything in the family, but he had this photo, and he had some poetry that she loved, and he could tell me she was a child of Eastern European Jewish immigrants, that they never went to synagogue again, right? That they could not believe in a God that will allow this to happen to their child, and they never went again. So again, you see this profound effect of these kinds of crimes. And it's important to know that, I think. And it's important for a writer like me to know that, so that I write about it like someone who remembers that these are not just stories that I'm using to illustrate a case, but these are stories of real people, right? They really still matter. And so one of the things that I think is really important in the way that we think about poison is that it tells us something about ourselves, the decisions we make. And I've said to people, one of the things that I like so much about telling stories of poison is that the people who kill by poison are outliers. They're a fairly small proportion of who we are. They're a small proportion of homicides. They've been going up. Homicidal poisonings in the United States have been going up for the last decade. But there's still a small proportion of homicides, and most of us, including the entire system that I write about here, dedicate our lives to hunting them down and making sure it doesn't happen. And in fact, this kind of event here almost never happens. The last case, and you may know it, where you saw someone mysteriously, randomly poisoning a large number of people was in Chicago, and it was cyanide and Tylenol. Does anyone remember that? So, and this was someone, I was thinking about this recently, this was someone who went in, injected cyanide into gel caps, Tylenol gel caps, and then resealed the boxes and just put them in random pharmacies around Chicago. And I think about 7 people died in that. And they never caught him. And that's something else that I have to tell you that I'm careful about. I almost never tell that story. You look like a trustworthy audience. But my goal, usually when I'm going out and talking about poison, is to emphasize the fact that most of these people get caught, right? Because the last thing I want to do is encourage someone to go out and think that they can brilliantly poison people. And that's the other point I want to make here before I move on to a more big picture issue, is most people do get caught. I watch poison stories all the time through Google alerts. And the foundation that we laid down here in this country in the 1920s and 30s transformed the way we catch poisoners. And the kind of issues that we saw back then, where poison was much more common, not what it is now, between 1% and 2% of all homicides, but 10% and higher, is because we built a science that was able to change that system. Can you get away with a poisoning today? Partly, right? But most people get caught. And just to give you an example of someone who almost got away, and it's not my Foxglove person, one of the more common homicidal poisons in the U.S. today, believe it or not, is antifreeze. Antifreeze is really sweet and tasteless. It's a problem for pets. The pharmacy department at UW-Madison has been running a campaign for years to get the state of Wisconsin to require manufacturers to make it more bitter. Illinois, and a lot of states have done that, including Illinois. But old-time, plain old antifreeze, I mean, I haven't sipped it, but is reputedly very sweet. Cats and dogs lick it off the floors of garages, and it causes real problems. And it's so sweet and tasteless that there was a woman in Georgia a few years ago who killed her husband by putting it in Jell-O, and he couldn't taste it. And she got away with that crime, and then she killed the next husband. Right. And when she killed the second husband, it looked a lot more suspicious. So when they looked, antifreeze does something. It contains a compound called ethylene glycol, or diethylene glycol. And what happens is the way you metabolize that, it forms very sharp crystals in your kidney. So it can look like kidney disease, but it basically cuts up your kidneys. And they dug up the first husband, and they saw that very characteristic pattern, and she went to prison. The one thing I can tell you, which is a useful tip, just in case you think someone's trying to kill you with antifreeze, is drink wine. Or beer or scotch, doesn't really matter, but the antidote for diethylene glycol poisoning is ethanol. And it changes the way you metabolize antifreeze, and it prevents the formation of those crystals. And if you went to the hospital with a suspected case of antifreeze poisoning, they would just give you an alcohol drip, right? Because that's the number one thing. So I've been thinking about always carrying a little flask with me, just in case. So there are many other great crimes and poisons from this period, but this case I just told you about is one of my favorites. And I want, before I come to a close, which I'm sort of winding to, and see if you have any questions, to talk about what Alexander Gettler and Charles Norris did in one other sense that I think is important today. And that is, as I said, we live in this chemical world, and we have to figure out how to navigate it. And most of us are probably not going to have to worry about being homicidally poisoned, but we do think sometimes about environmental contaminants or chemicals that we're exposed to in our everyday lives. So I want to talk about a couple of, at least one case. One is, and most people don't know this, but it's an interesting insight into how this works. Most people don't know or don't remember that in 1925, the city of New York, based on the work by Alexander Gettler and Charles Norris, banned leaded gasoline. And they banned it because they had done the work that showed that lead in gasoline was a really bad idea and a dangerous environmental contaminant. And what had happened was, if you go back into the 1920s, and if you go back through the history of the automobile before the catalytic converter, you know that gasoline cars used to famously have knocking problems. Does anyone remember? You'd get those explosive knocks in the engine. The car would almost jump on the street. You'd jump. And so automobile manufacturers were really trying to figure out how to make that problem go away. And there was a chemist at General Motors, his name was Thomas Midgley, who came up with the idea of adding a compound to gasoline called tetraethyl lead. And Midgley is also famous, by the way, because his other great invention was Freon for air conditioning systems, which also turned out to have environmental consequences regarding the ozone layer. But tetraethyl lead got rid of most of the knocking problem in short order. And the automobile industry loved it, and the oil industry loved it, and Standard Oil in New Jersey added a whole new building just to add tetraethyl lead into gasoline. And the workers, and nobody thought of lead as dangerous, nobody. So the workers didn't really even wear any protections. And the nickname that the workers gave that building was the Looney Gas Building. Because, as we now know, lead is very neurotoxic. And at the very high levels these workers were exposed to, they developed all kinds of sort of neurological symptoms. They lost their memories, they lost their tempers, they wandered hopelessly around the plant, and some of them literally went crazy and had to be taken away in straitjackets. And in September of 1925, this all because lead bioaccumulates. You saw this sort of crash and burn at that factory. About 7 people died, and they closed it down. And the state of New Jersey sent all this information and some of the bodies to New York City, which had the best forensic chemistry department in the country. And it took them about a month. They had to develop the apparatus. But they came back and they said, these guys were poisoned by lead. Lead is neurotoxic, and this is how forward-looking they were. They went out and they actually started gathering lead samples out of the streets of New York City at that time and said, and we're starting to see lead deposits in the streets, and we think this needs to be banned. And the city of New York banned leaded gasoline in that year. And then the state of New Jersey banned it. And then the city of Philadelphia banned it. And at that point, the manufacturers went to the current president, who was Calvin Coolidge, who was famously anti-regulation, and said, make this go away. This is really irritating. Make it go away. And so Coolidge appointed a commission of only industry scientists. And the following year, Midgley was on that commission. Charles Norris and Alexander Gettler and their ilk were not. And the following year, the federal government declared that lead was just fine, and they were going to supersede all of these local regulations, and we were going to go back to leaded gasoline, which, in fact, we did. Lead was finally started to be phased out in the 1980s, really, although the EPA started, pulling it back in the 70s, but it really disappeared mostly because of the invention of the catalytic converter. And once you had that, you could no longer, so technology cleaned it up, right? But that's an interesting point, I think, one, because you can have very good scientists doing very good environmental work, and in the 1920s, as we sometimes see today, have that superseded by politics and economics, right? And when you go back and you look, and this was fascinating to me at how much they knew at that time period about lead, about radiation poisoning, about what was in cigarette smoke, which was, I had no idea how many poisonous compounds they had identified by 1928 in cigarette smoke. You realize that we need to actually pay more attention to what we already know as we try to figure out the compounds of today. And we need to remember that we cannot understand who we are today unless we go back and look at how we got there. The last thing I want to say really quickly here is that if you look now at the accidental death statistics in this country, poisoning is now the number one cause of death. Accidental poisoning is the number one cause of death in this country, accidental death, for people between the ages of 25 and 64. About 3 or 4 years ago, it actually passed automobile accidents in that status. And the reason that is beautifully illustrated by this slide. It's the rise of it's the abuse of painkillers in particular, right? So we're seeing more and more people, overprescription, overuse. And there was actually, this week is, you'll be happy to know, is Poison Prevention Week, National Poison Prevention Week. So I was looking at some of the stories about this, and one of the points they made is that a lot of these poisonings are poisonings of children, and the places that kids are getting these pills, they're not going into those locked medicine cabinets. They're getting them off coffee tables. They're finding them in sofas. They're finding them on the floor. So I want to mention this because it's really important to realize that even though these are old compounds, they're still dangerous. And we still need to treat them with respect. And we still need to be aware of how much we're still figuring out this very fascinating, complicated, beautiful, fundamental, and sinister chemical world that we live in. And the last thing I want to say, which I think is one of my favorite lessons from working on Poisoner's Handbook, is that it's a reminder of one other thing, that individual people make a difference. It's really the story of two very determined people. In this case, two scientists who are working in a city laboratory and are able to change the world. And that, I think, is a positive message. That if we care enough, and if we work hard enough, and if we are determined to make a difference, even an underpaid civil servant in a laboratory that looks like this can change the world we live in today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have some time for questions, so raise your hand and I'll bring around the microphone so everyone can hear.
Over here. And now you'll realize that I usually give very long answers.
This won't take a long answer. Didn't Napoleon die on St. Helena?
Mm-hmm.
Not Elba.
No, that's exactly right. But in both cases, he had shield green wallpaper, right? He was poisoned both places. So this wallpaper was everything. There was actually a great story about Clara Luce Booth when she was ambassador to Italy, and she was poisoned by the wallpaper and had to resign her ambassadorship. I mean, this wallpaper, this arsenic-tinted wallpaper was just everywhere. And when I was working on a previous book, which was about the science of the supernatural, and was focused on William James, he had to actually go in and strip. They had to move out of their house in Boston, and he had to go because they had to get rid of all that arsenic-contaminated wallpaper in the house. So you'd be astonished at how prevalent this was. People were just very comfortable with arsenic, and I've asked myself why. Because it was a famous homicidal poison on the one hand, and everyone's favorite kitchen helper on the other hand. It's we have this very weird kind of attitude toward these things.
I don't think that you told us who was responsible for the poisoning in the restaurant.
They never caught the person. It was so, and I sort of leapt from that to the Tylenol case. They thought that it was one of the two bakers in the restaurant who had heard a rumor that he was going to be fired, even though he wasn't. And the two bakers were a number of the staffers in the restaurant got very sick, but the bakers were unscathed. But they couldn't ever find the evidence, right? And one of the problems then was that it was really easy to go down and get arsenic and not leave a trace, right? You just picked up some cosmetics for your wife, or rat poison was and fly paper were commonly arsenic-based at that time. My favorite rat poisons was called Rough on Rats. For some reason, I just love that name, but it was 93% white arsenic, right? And fly paper, there were a couple of fly paper murders in which people took the fly paper, soaked it, made an arsenic water, and then used it to poison. I think in one case it was a boarder, and in one case it was a husband. And there's a great mystery story by the writer Dashiell Hammett, who wrote The Maltese Falcon, which is just called Fly Paper. And I realized, I picked this book up at a 1944 murder mystery collection, opened it up and said, the title was Fly Paper, and I thought, oh, that's got to be arsenic. And I thought, boy, I'm getting way too into this stuff, right? And I think there was a question over here.
On your comments about leaded gasoline, it occurs to me that once they started putting the lead back in, all the pumps had signs on them. Danger, contains tetraethyl lead. You know, that's the way the bureaucracy takes care of things. Just put a sign on it.
Just a little label, right. But the interesting thing is, and I wish I'd bought this, I really like to junk around antique stores. The Standard Oil, it was Standard Oil, and was it DuPont? But two of these big companies formed a corporation. They called it the Ethyl Corporation. And you'll see that, and you can go back and you can look at magazines of the time and see Ethyl Corporation ads. And I saw one in one of the antique stores on Odana Road, which I've just been kicking myself that I didn't buy. But it was of two dolphins leaping through a rainbow, and it said, "And ethyl gasoline makes the world better." And in this kind of magical, happy dolphin sense. So so even though they had those labels, the advertising campaigns were very different. In the same way I think you could say was true with cigarettes, right? You have the labels on the cigarettes, but in the days when you really had cigarette advertising, everyone was really healthy and happy and, riding horses into the sunset and all the other things that they did. So yeah, they did do that. It would say tetraethyl lead right on the...
I'm not sure, but I think it was standard in New York.
I think you're right. And you see, it's not like we don't still do these kinds of things, right? Label something in one way and advertise it the other. It's kind of interesting in the truth in advertising thing to me anymore. When you're listening to the pharmaceutical ads on television and they do the side effects thing, and by the end of it you're thinking, why would anyone take that drug? Right? So... But just to give you one more, I want to come back to arsenic in another way. So one of the things that I do today is, in addition to this book, is that I write about poisoning chemistry for a Wired magazine. It's a blog called Elemental. And one of the things that I've been pursuing recently is Arsenic and Rice. Have any of you heard this issue? And so I'm actually working on a story for it right now for Discover Magazine, which is a science magazine that just moved to Wisconsin. Used to be in New York, yay, but is now in Waukesha at the Combat Corporation. So, as it turns out, the number one source of arsenic in our lives is either well water, right, and there are certainly areas of Wisconsin that have high levels of arsenic in private well water, or food. And the number one source of arsenic in the human diet is rice. And there's a couple of reasons for that you may find interesting. One, the rice plant turns out to be a phenomenal vacuum for arsenic. It's designed to pull the mineral silicon out of the soil. It stiffens the grain, right? It needs it. And it has a transporter system to pull that out of the soil and make those beautiful stiff rice grains. And the arsenic in its structure and in its electrical charge looks to the rice plant exactly like silicon. So the rice plant is literally an arsenic vacuum. And in fact, it's about, I can't remember, it's between 10 and 50 times more arsenic is taken up by rice than any other grain. And the other thing is that there's a lot of naturally occurring arsenic, but in the United States, we grow a lot of rice in the southeast or in the south where we used to grow cotton. And in the early 20th century, our favorite cotton pesticide was lead arsenate. And so those soils where we used to grow cotton are loaded with arsenic. And scientists came in and they did a market basket survey of the United States, and they found that if it was rice grown in Texas or Louisiana or one of those cotton growing states, that you really got the highest dose of arsenic in rice. So I started writing about this on my blog. I've now had my 4th conversation with the USA Rice Federation, and I am not their favorite person. And I went up this year to Dartmouth for this story I'm working on. Dartmouth did a really interesting study looking at brown rice syrup, which is the other part of the rice story. So when the rice takes up arsenic, where does it store it? It stores it in the bran and in the outer husk. So if you have nice, less healthy white rice, you've polished off the arsenic, right? Brown rice is, white rice is simply polishing away that brown and that outer shell. So white rice has much less arsenic than brown rice. And things sweetened with brown rice syrup have the highest level of arsenic at all because the syrup concentrates, right? It's a sugar concentrate. It concentrates the brown rice. So Dartmouth did a study, it was a couple of years ago, it looked at, I just dropped this, organic baby formula. And the organic baby formula was high in arsenic because it was sweetened with brown rice syrup. And, what was it? It was like Cliff. You ever seen those Cliff kind of healthy bars, right? Those were like phenomenally high in arsenic. Why do we care? This is not a lethal dose of arsenic because there's a lot of studies now that look at arsenic at a part per billion level and show that at a part per million level, it just sort of undermines your health. You're not going to drop dead, right? But it just degrades your immune system a little. It just breaks down some of the cells in your vascular system a little. One of the scientists I talked to said, well, the thing about arsenic is, it doesn't push you over the cliff, but it'll take you right to the edge. So one of the examples he gave me, this was a study with mice, was that they took mice, they shaved the hair on the mice live a really sucky life in a laboratory, in case you wonder. But they took mice, shaved the hair off their back, exposed them to ultraviolet light, a good sunburn, right? They had mice that were on an arsenic-laced diet at about 10 parts per billion, which is the EPA level in drinking water. They had mice that had a lovely arsenic-free diet, and what they saw was that in the mice on the arsenic-based diet, skin cancer went up, right? And they went back and looked, and they discovered that arsenic at the part per billion level interferes with the genetic repair mechanisms in the body, right? So everyone's trying to figure this out now. Let me say this about rice. I still eat rice. And I think this is why the rice people don't like me. I'm not telling you not to eat rice. If you were going to eat rice by the truckload every day, if it's like I love rice, I must eat at least 3 or 4 cups of rice today, then basmati rice and jasmine rice are the lowest varieties for arsenic, and I would just eat those rices, okay? And there's a lot of good scientists who are now looking at ways to genetically modify rice plants, right? So it's like, here's a problem, here's the solution. If we tweak the genes of the rice plant just a little, then we can get it to exclude arsenic and just take up silicon. And so you're seeing people starting to do some of that too. So it's fascinating. They're fascinating poisons. They tell us a lot about what the world is like. They tell us a lot about how our bodies work, right? They tell us how to, and we learn as we study them how to better protect ourselves. And we learn to be smarter. And I guess that's what I like. It's not that I sit there and go, now I'm really afraid or chemophobic or worried that I'm going to poison myself. Although I do actually read the labels for brown rice syrup now in a very neurotic, annoying way. And my family, the other thing, aside from the fact that my husband won't let me pour him coffee, is prone to say, don't tell us anything about our dinner, right? We don't want to know anything about what we're eating. Quit informing us. But I do think it's important to be aware, right? Share information and just be smarter about these things. Chemistry makes the world a more interesting place, right? I think we forget that sometimes. But the fantastic, complicated chemical world we live in, when we see it, just shows us all how lucky we are. We live in this amazing environment, this dance of chemistry and relationship that changes as we speak. I love that. I love knowing that. And so, for someone with a short attention span, I still love talking about chemistry and writing about chemistry. So, see, I can give a long answer to a non-question.
Deb, thank you so much. Everybody, join me in thanking Professor Blum one more time.
Thank you. Ooh.
Thanks again to everybody for joining us tonight. We will be back again on Thursday, April 18th at 7 p.m. in the Grand Hall here for John Peavy House and his update on political transitions in the Middle East. Have a great evening and keep cheering on for the Badgers and spring. Good night.